The mare's head dipped once, then twice, slow as if it could count the sun, until it found the place where it would stop. Dust lifted in a sickle where her flanks had brushed the trail. Elias Ward felt the animal's warmth fade through the cinch and knew, with a clarity that had nothing to do with hope, that she was done. Around them the plain held its breath, heat shivering off the hard-packed earth, grass blades limp and pale. The town lay a thin smear of buildings on the horizon, a place of a trading post, a smith and a saloon where men who never left had too many reasons not to stay. Elias had a reason to go north, to find steady work, and a season that would let him save what little he had left. He would buy a horse and move on. It was how he had kept himself whole since the fire, on the road, a measure between him and the past. He had almost said the words aloud when the thought came, as if it had been waiting behind his ribs, "Take me with you." It was not a promise, not a plea. It threaded itself through the heat and the huff of the mare's breath and hung there, unnecessary and urgent. Elias wiped his palms on his trousers. He did not know who it was for. The question felt new and old all at once, like a hinge creaking after long disuse, an invitation and a test. He could not answer it because the mare could not. He only had hands and a halter, and the sense that to keep moving meant moving away from whatever had not been mended inside him. The trading post sat at the edge of town like a watchful thing, weatherboard pale, awning sagging, bell above the door thin and bright. Men looked up from cards and whiskey when he led the mare in, and the silence pressed against Elias in the way of something waiting for him to drop his weight. He half expected the town to turn him out. Some towns did, as a courtesy. Others measured a man by the dust in his boots. The clerk's eyes moved past him, landing on the mare. A hand appeared with a coffee cup. He accepted it like a man who had learned to take what was offered without question. That is where he saw her. A woman with a braid that fell down her back like a rope of dark river water, a strip of beadwork at the strap of her satchel, catching the light with small, precise color. Not a woman of the town, not the color of the clerks and the stable hands. She moved with the economy of person who lives by necessity, every motion measured, some parts of her face set into a guarded line. She carried a box wrapped in oilcloth, and something, an arm perhaps, was bandaged beneath the sleeve. Elias noticed the bandage like a dog notices a scent trail. He noticed, too, the way the trading post softened for a moment, as if she had opened the door to a different weather, and the room drew nearer to listen. Their exchange was the careful language of two people who have practiced measure. She did not smile. There was no invitation in her eyes. He did not offer more than he had to. His voice was the sound of a tool leaning against a fence. When he stepped forward to take her box, just the thing a man could do, boring and practical, she stiffened. "No," she said, and his name did not exist on her lips. He did not insist. He moved closer anyway and took the box. "Won't make a show of it," he said, because politeness had always been workmanlike for him. He set the box across the back of his pack-horse, the way he had learned to set things down, placing weight where it could be held. Her hand brushed the beadwork by some reflex, and then relaxed. "You heading north?" she asked, and it was not the kind of question that asked for a story. "Work up that way, seasonal, need a new horse," Elias replied. Saying the horse aloud made it a wound and a purpose at the same time. He had less than that, expectation and a plan that ran to the next town. He tried not to think of how the mare had been his only accommodation to the last few years of his wandering, how she had borne him through storms and kept him from being homeless by the mercy of the road. He had given her a name once, but names had a way of catching in the throat. She watched him with eyes that saw more than the trading post. "You can leave the animal here," she said. "There's someone at the smith. He'll look at her." Her voice carried the plain's hardness softened by a thread of something he sensed and couldn't name, care that did not bow to entreaty. She moved to the door with him when he unhooked the mare, and the light hit the beadwork on her satchel like a small declaration. Out on the street, a wind cut the heat, an edge Ellis hadn't accounted for. Somewhere beyond the flat line of town, a sky had begun to thicken. "I can help if you want," he offered, because hands are the only honest diplomacy he knew. She paused only a heartbeat longer, then inclined her head. They walked together toward the smith. It was a short distance, but in that walk, the town seemed to shrink away, the people rustling back into their places. The mare leaned her weight against his leg once and sighed. Elias felt the animal's rib cage through the saddle like a slow, forbearing apology. At the smith, a long-bearded man under a sweat-dark shirt took one look and said the mare was done for. Elias stood with his hand on the animal's flank, while the man spoke words of an economy that meant this was not a matter of sentiment. The smith's hands were large and truthful. He offered a price for the old horse's hide if Elias wanted it taken away. He could offer a list of horses in the next town, steady animals that would carry a man but would not ask questions. Elias listened. He knew the answers before they were spoken. The mare had been his since a place he tried not to name. He had no money for anything but the root. He had a hole inside him shaped like the sound of fire and the diagram of a house. The mare had kept him from falling all the way into that hole. The smith's pragmatism was a kind of mercy. "Next town's got a roan," the man said. "Sturdy. Will hold a man through the winter." That was the plan then. Buy the horse. Move on. Keep the habit of moving. "We can take her to my cabin," the woman said abruptly. "I've got a spot by the lean-to. Shelter till morning. You can rest." Elias registered the offer as a physical thing, a hand laid against the map of his plan. He had meant to make it alone. And yet the storm that had only threaded the edge of the sky now cracked its fist open and threatened rain. Wind pushed dust into their mouths. The trading post's bell clanged once in the space of a gust, the sound like a small warning. He did not look at her in the way that people look when they're bargaining. He looked at her like someone who had been given the right to hear a sentence, as if it mattered more than the words. "All right," he said. "If you are enjoying this story, like and comment where you're listening from," the clerk called out with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And then they were leaving the trading post, and the sky was giving up the first heavy drops. The ride to the cabin was a slow, sodden thing. Rain washed the dust into the earth and turned the road into two fins of mud. The mare walked with the weight of a long journey in her joints, and when she took a step that slid, she planted her feet with a stubbornness that made Elias think of things that would not be coaxed back into shape. The woman's hands were steady on the reins of her pack-horse. She moved with small, economical gestures, readiness at the wrist, a way of bracing herself against gusts. When they reached the line of low pines that marked the limit of her land, she reined in and pointed, not unkindly, but with something near the edge of patience, to a cabin that leaned into the wind like it had been listening all its life. "You sure you don't mind?" Elias asked, although the question was a courtesy. "No," she said. "You can stay. There's a lean-to for the mare." The cabin smelled of sage smoke and old wood. The roof had been patched with a dozen different types of metal and a patience that had been paid in hands rather than coin. A small garden lay like a map of stubborn green between the house and the fence, rows held by stones and the patient logic of someone who trusted where water gathered. On the porch, a chair had been carved down to a silhouette. It held the shape of someone accustomed to waiting. Inside, the cabin was a reduction of what Elias had thought a home should be. No frills, a bed with a patched quilt, a hearth blackened to a familiar rhythm, shelves that held jars and tins with labels smudged by hands. The woman moved with a grace that made work look clean. She stripped the bandage from her arm and set the cloth aside, patting the limb to encourage him not to stare. A pale crescent of scar-work rose across the inside of her forearm like a riverboat wake. There was no melodrama in the mark. It was a map of something she had carried through and not been defined by. "That's from the last winter," she said, when he could not quite place the way she had handled the wound. A burned stove. The admission was small and unadorned. It was not a plea, and it was not a story meant to bend him. It was a fact laid on the table. Elias thought of the fire that had taken his house, the one thing he had let himself name in the years after. He thought of the way heat had reached into his ribs and changed him. He turned his face because the inside of him was a place that did not need to be explained. "Same as mine," he said, "not a confession, just a ledger." They moved to the hearth. She handed him a tin cup with tea that smelled of sage and some other herb he could not name, and that made his jaw loosen. The rain made the roof shiver, and the sound of it was busy and forgiving. He sat with his hands clasped over the cup. He had a tendency to fix things by looking at the place where they broke. It had saved lives, and it had been a way to avoid talking about what hurt inside. "You can sleep by the fire," she said, and there was no softness in it that asked for gratitude. It was a simple arrangement. He accepted because it was offered, because to refuse would have been its own admission. When he moved to unstrap his pack, his fingers found the box's missing latch, and he thought of the mare and the town before the rain had softened it into something else. That night, when wind tried to take the cabin by the shoulders and rain hammered like a fist, the roof that had been patched with a carpenter's improvisation began to leak. Water stitched down the rafters and made a small, honest threat of ruining the quilt. They moved as if they had been rehearsing for a necessity, a bucket under each leak, a blanket lifted and salted into shape. His hands were quick and practical. Hers were steady, checking the seams, wrapping a flattened nail back into a beam that had come loose sometime after moonlight. They set planks across the rafters, where metal had split. The work was simple. It was something honest that did not require speech. She watched him as he hammered, an angle of chin and the faintest looseness at the corner of her mouth. Elias felt, for the first time in a long while, that his hands meant something beyond repair. They meant company. He had always gauged his worth by the ease with which he could do a job. Here was a place where that ease translated into some other currency: shared shelter, a warm meal, a bowl left for the mare. When the labor settled, they sat close to the hearth. The lantern threw their shadows across the wall, strangers' shadows, half reunited by the same light. She handed him a piece of bread still warm from the coals. "You don't have to leave at first light," she said, and the sentence was small enough to pass as an observation. "Don't suppose I have much choice in the matter," he said. "Need a horse." She did not look surprised. "There are horses to be had," she said, "and there are things that are sometimes less portable." He almost asked what she meant, and then did not. The wealth of silence between them was the kind of thing that taught you a more honest vocabulary than words. He drank the tea and felt it slide down like something that could be trusted. In the morning, the mare had taken a turn for the worse. The smith had been right. Elias put his hand on her flank and thought about every odd mercy the animal had offered him: shelter from weather, the thud of hooves on road to tell you were moving. The woman did not say he should let the horse go. She stood with him in the lean-to while he made the decision he had known he would. When the mare did not rise, Elias sat on the ground and rested his forehead against her flank until men at the trading post came with a cart and took the animal away. He watched as the cart's wheels became a dot and then nothing. He felt oddly bereft, as if he had been stripped of a small but certain identity. "We'll get you a horse," the woman said, and it was not a promise, it was a plan, pragmatic and quiet. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. His fingers came away with dust and wet. Her name was Ayoka. She gave it as a fact when he asked, not because he had pressed, but because some things require a label for the world to hold them steady. The name sat easily on her like a braid. She did not offer ancestry as a story to be told. She wore her beadwork and the braid like a thing that had decided its own measure. Elias learned, as days unfurled, that to ask about it too soon was to show one lacked patience. He practiced patience. The rhythm of their days drew in like a tide. He had come expecting to move on. Instead, he found hours made of small agreements. He would fetch wood before the light had reached the horizon and lay it by the stove. He would mend the broken slat of fence that held in the small garden, and Ioka would teach him where the soil sank, where the ground drank quick, and where the water lay hidden like a secret. She knew the land as a reader knows a book by touch, where it would give underfoot, where a spring would begin to whisper after a late rain. He learned to watch the way water made patterns in the grass, and to read the tracks left by deer, and the different way a coyote's steps answered a dog's. She taught him to knot a hitch in a rope so a man could trust a load to it. Their conversation was of the small, revealing kind. What a man said about the weather, and what a woman said about the shape of a seed, told as much as talk of past fires. They mended things with hands, a stove hinge, a churn, the broken frame of his belt. He taught her to set a hinge squarely, to drive a nail that would not split the grain. She showed him how to carry water in a bucket balanced at one hip, so the walk across the yard would not spill more than a quarter of its load. They were two professionals at different trades. Their competency became the grammar of their companionship. At night, they ate stew, whose broth had been coaxed patient and honest from stew bones and root, and a handful of dried beans. The scent of sage blended with the stew and spread through the cabin like a benediction, ordinary and sustaining. They spoke in fragments at the table, what the county road had been like this season, where the smith had found a strip of copper, how the mare had carried him when things were lesser. When a silence settled, it was not the awkwardness of strangers, but the comfortable void of two people who had, through ordinary acts, made a new kind of tolerance. There were small things he learned about her without being told. She kept a jar on a high shelf with a patch of cloth tied over it, and once he had reached and pulled it down, a photograph slid from the folds. He saw an arm around shoulders, a face partly hidden by smoke and sun, someone smiling in a way he recognized as neither defiant nor worn, just true. She caught his hand as his fingers brushed it and didn't demand it returned. He did not pry. The photograph became a kind of relic, present, private, respectable. Ayoka's caution was not the same as reserve. She guarded herself, but she did not hide the fact she knew how to read the weather or how to put a sprig of an herb into tea that would loosen a cough. Her knowledge was practical and earned. Elias admired it because he knew how hard such knowledge is to gather through winters, through trouble, through patient watchfulness of a land that will not be coerced. He found himself asking questions he had not intended to ask. Where the water pooled after a storm, how a rabbit's trail would fold into a badger's, where a quicksand lay hidden beneath a bloom of grass. She answered him without lecturing. There were evenings when the quiet between them carried the ghost of something more, a hand on a nail, the passing of a cup, a lantern passed across a brow that had been streaked with sawdust. Their intimacy was measured in small touches, the press of a palm to steady a beam, the careful retie of a strap around a bundle. Elias noticed how he began to map his hours to hers, rising not merely because a trail demanded it, but because there was satisfaction in matching someone else's rhythm. He found himself thinking less about leaving and more about next week's fence posts and whether the lean-to needed new supports before the cold came. The work of living knit them together in the daylit way of people who share chores. The barn, if what they laid claim to could be called a barn, received the first attention. They raised posts and set a beam that took both of them to lever and steady. His hands and hers moved as if they had always been partners in such labor. When a beam would not sit true, she would look at it, breathe, and say, "Lift," in a voice that resembled a command and a suggestion. He would lift. They would laugh, subdued and private, at the way it sometimes took two people to make a thing right. On the fourth week, while they were hauling stones for the stable's foundation, a group of riders passed along the ridge. and the world tightened in the way a held breath draws a man's shoulders up. It was the kind of moment that had no blood in view but still had teeth. They circled at a distance and then passed, leaving behind the sound of hooves' echoes and an air that smelled faintly of whiskey and cheap leather. Elias saw Ayoka's hand tighten on the rope and the quick, small movement that set her stance like a fence. Her jaw flexed. She gave herself a measure of breath. "Men from town," she said quietly. "They've been watching." It was not a question. Elias had noticed them at the trading post before, stares that lingered too long, a folded contempt in the corner of a man's mouth. The rider's presence tonight carried old meanings that had nothing to do with him personally. It meant a town that was uncomfortable with a woman who lived alone, with a man who arrived and then stayed a little longer than expected. They did not approach the cabin that night. They rode by, looking as they passed, the leader's shadow long across his face. The sensation it left in Elias was of a hand laid on a shoulder for measurement. Men like that were what made a man have to choose the shape of his life. He felt suddenly the old urge that had always set him riding, an urge to be somewhere else before anything was asked of him. He thought of the roan the smith had mentioned, of the road that led north to work and not to questions. He felt the old swivel toward leaving, a reflex as ingrained as the way a man ties his boot. Ayoka watched him as if she could read his pull. She did not say she feared the riders. She did not invite sympathy. She moved with a steadiness that suggested she had weathered such measures before. "They'll test the land," she said. "They like to see if someone will bend." "Push them away!" Elias said, more sharply than he had meant. Protectiveness flared in him like a flare of flint. The impulse to stand between a threat and what he had lately come to call his place was a new taste in his mouth, and it surprised him. Ayoka's mouth twitched in the corner, and for a moment he could not tell if it was laughter or a small pity. "They test with questions," she said, "and with ways to make you move. Sometimes they think a man will take the easy road. Sometimes it's cheaper than turning a plow." Elias did not need to be told that towns have a way of measuring worth with a scale of convenience. He had known it in the faces at the trading post. But hearing it from her in the quiet cabin made the world narrower and the choice clearer. Leave and keep the habit of drifting, or stand and accept that staying meant more than a bed by the hearth. That night he could not sleep. The lantern burned low and sent a gold pool onto the wooden floor. He sat at the window and watched the land breathe in the low light. Somewhere beyond their plot, the ridge held its black line. He found the phrase, "Because some things find you when your mind goes quiet. Take me with you." This time he felt it as an almost temptation, the road personified, offering not only a new horse, but the possibility of carrying her along with him, of making of her a companion in the itinerant life he knew. The idea was at once gentle and violent. It suggested a future that would move them both like furniture. He imagined the mare he would buy, and them riding out, the country rolling under them, the town shrinking. It was a shape that pulled at a wound inside him, the one that had learned to close itself with motion. It sat on him like a question he couldn't answer. Ayoka, watching from the other chair, folded her hands over her knees. Her face yielded nothing but an odd smallness around the eyes, like someone who was not surprised the night keeps a man awake with decisions. She did not speak the words aloud. She did not need to. The silence between them carried the offer and the refusal in equal weight. In the weeks that followed, riders passed more than once, always along the ridge, always looking. Men at the trading post said little and turned their heads one way or another. The town's eyes were a constant hum. Elias found his hunger for the road receding like a tide. He measured days, not by how far he could ride, but by whether the fence would stand tomorrow, whether the mare's manger would be clean, whether the lean-to's beams would take the next winter's wind. Work had always steadied him. Now it had settled into something that could be called contentment. Yet the question that had first come as a reflex "take me with you" lingered like a stain on the margin of a map. He would think of it when he saddled a borrowed horse at dawn to ride to town for supplies and feel it like a hand at his back. Sometimes he imagined asking Ayoka if she would come. Sometimes he imagined taking her without a question. Both images were imperfect, both suggested different kinds of seeing. Ayoka did not attempt to make the choice for him. Never did she ask him to decide. There was an integrity to her refusal to push, the quiet confidence of someone who knows that partnership built from obligation never lasts. She offered what she could, the knowledge of the land, a roof, a shared cigarette on a porch in the evenings. She let decisions remain his to make. When he would talk of going to town, she would nod and offer practical advice. Which merchant would have better saddles, where a man could find a horse that had not been bred on speed but on steadiness? Her answers were more like a ledger than a therapy. Facts to use, not reasons to feel. At the trading post, Elias learned how quickly a man's schedule can be altered by another's expectations. He had left planning to the smith and came back with a deposit and a name scribbled on a list, a roan in the next town. The thought of the roan gave him a sort of lightness he had not expected. It also drew the question like a parenthesis in his chest. If he bought the horse and left in the morning, would that be an evasion or a sensible thing? The rider's presence bothered him. He kept glancing at his hands to be sure they were the hands that had repaired roofs and pitched beams, not the hands that might let him flee. When he galloped back to the cabin with the news, the wind in his face felt less like a promise and more like a test. He found Ayoka at the fence, bent over, her fingers plugged into the earth as if she were checking its pulse. She looked up when he called her name, and the expression on her face was unreadable, a map with no legend. He could not tell if his news mattered. "I can leave with the roan tomorrow," he said. Saying the future aloud made it a thing that could be refused or accepted. His sentence landed in the space between them and echoed. She stirred and stood, dusting her hands on her skirt. For a heartbeat he thought she might say she would come. That flash of want was a visible thing in his chest. Instead, she looked at him straight on. "Take me with you?" she said. Not a plea, but a question that carried all the weight of truth. The air around them tightened. It was not an action to be dismissed. The words were simple and honest, and they sat between the two of them like a plank, waiting to be nailed into place. Elias tasted the answer before he spoke, like copper and something colder. He felt the pull to the road, the familiar pattern that promised to blunt his grief with distance. He felt, too, a new pull toward the cabin, the warmth of a place that would not require him to move to be useful, a person who was not a project, but a partner. He did not answer at once. He had learned over the years that honesty sometimes looks like silence. He looked at the line of the ridge, at the road that led away, at the pasture that thundered with nothing telling, only the wind. The mare's absence was a hollow he had not known how to measure. He could take her and continue the drift, let the land become another stop on a ledger he kept in his head. He could also stay and make of this place a ledger of its own, fence posts, a stable, a garden filled come spring. "Take me with you." The words lay there, not quite a door, but a hinge. Ayoka did not step closer. She did not force his hand, she merely waited, and waiting for her was a kind of motion, patient, exacting. Elias understood then that the offer was not a bargain. It was an invitation that required a choice of equal weight. He felt the old impulse to mount and ride. It was a reflex shaped by grief and habit. He felt the other impulse, an urge to put planks down by the lean-to, to nail a stable beam that would not shift when the wind came in the next month. He thought of the riders at the ridge, and how staying would mean making a life under a constant measuring gaze. He thought of the photograph, the jar, the things that defined her as human in a way that wanted to be known and not explained away. His answer was not ready. He could not make the rope taut in the space of a heartbeat. There were parts of the cabin, parts of himself, that still needed mending. He reached for a response that would not be a surrender nor a rejection, something that would honor the question without eating it up. The sky pulled back into color, as if the world could wait to see what he would do. The horses in the yard stamped at the ground. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked. Elias folded his hands, felt the calluses on his palms, the way a man checks the tools that will decide him. He had lived with motion long enough to know its comforts. He had been alone long enough to know his own patterns. Choosing would mean naming a life in space. Taking her with him would mean displacing her into the unknown, while staying would mean asking her to accept a new name for what she had already built. He thought of another thing, that choice is not the end of work, but the beginning of it. Whether he left or stayed, whether she followed or remained, they would have to craft a life out of tools and patience. He felt the steadiness of his hands and the steadiness of hers, and realized that the world needed both kinds. The riders' silhouettes reappeared across the ridge that evening, smaller now, their presence a low drum. The question hung between Elias and Ioka like a piece of cloth in the wind, ready to be either folded away or stretched into a banner. He had to go to town for the roan. He had to measure his heart in the company of other men and see if the road still tempted him more than the hearth. When he mounted the borrowed horse the next morning, the ground under his feet was a map with 2 destinations. He left his pack by the lean-to and took with him only what would fit in a saddlebag. Ioka stood at the gate and watched him go. She did not hold his hand, nor did she call after him. She simply watched, a figure at the edge of his map. The wind tugged at the braid at her spine and made the beadwork flash like a memory. As he rode, the land flowed by, familiar lines, a dust road he could follow with his eyes closed. The ridge rose ahead of him, the town a little smear against the horizon. In the rhythm of his horse's gait, the phrase came again, as if the road itself had voice. "Take me with you." He said nothing aloud. The words had been offered and refused again, like a debt. He felt them as a cold undercoat to an old fear. Would staying mean a life he had not yet learned how to live? Would leaving mean betraying a woman who had not asked to be carried? The roan, the riders, the town clerk's curl of lip, all of it turned and measured him. He rode on, the sun in his face, and a question already set to the measure of his hands. The town lay ahead, in the same thin smear as it had when he left, but closer now, edged with sun and the smell of dust warmed by human bodies. Elias rode through its wide street with his shoulders squared as if he were only carrying sacks, when inside him a ledger of decisions turned like a windmill. The roan was a thing to be bought. The town's distance from the cabin was a measure he could put his hands around. Buying a horse was business. Choosing a life was not. He tethered the borrowed animal at the trading post just past noon. Men nodded to him in the slow, practiced way of men who keep accounts with other men's faces. The smith's shop held the smell of hot iron and oil like a familiar truth. The roan's owner, a lean man with an eye for gates, spoke of temper and age as if they were different currencies. Elias listened, fingers flexing at the reins, thinking of nails and hinges, of how a thing either fit a frame or it did not. "She'll make a man steady," the seller said, tapping the roan's flank. "Not fast, but steady." Elias watched the horse's ribs move, the clean line of shoulder, the sure set of hoof. For a man shaped by motion, steadiness felt almost like an insult and nearly a salvation. He thought for a moment of mounting and riding north with the roan and Ioka beside him, both of them drifting the way 2 people hold a tent pole to keep a storm off. The image was warm and seemed to smooth things. It was also lopsided. He would be the one who moved the map. He would be the one who uprooted her. "I'll take her," he said finally, because the roan was a simple mathematics he trusted. Coin for beast. He put down a deposit in the seller's hand, the money heavy and honest. The man smiled a little and said, "Good choice." He did not ask where the buyer planned to go. Outside the trading post, the town showed itself in other ways. Men at the saloon lounged where shade pooled and looked at him with the measuring eyes that had sometimes followed him when the mare still breathed. The leader of the riders, the man whose shadow had been long on the ridge, sat with a small band at one table, his hat tipped back. Elias recognized the jaw at once, square, practiced in the work of making centuries of men. He felt the man's eyes like a scale. Elias did not seek them. He ate quickly, drank black coffee as if it would drown the turning thought, and then moved toward the smith to wind up the roan sail. On the way, he passed the rider-master. Their gazes caught. The leader recognized him, though probably by reputation more than by name. There was a small pause, the breath between two men who have choices to make of one another, then a nod, the color of civility. "Bought yourself a new mount?" the leader asked, voice carrying without effort. "Aye," Elias said. He was careful not to name where he was going. Men in a town read more from what was withheld than what was offered. The leader studied him and then gave a little bark of a laugh that had no warmth to it. Good for a man. The conversation sat there like a tool one did not need. It could be taken up or put down. Elias left it in the dust and moved on. He had the roan under the smith's care. The animal would be ready by the next day. He had in his pack a list, saddles, a length of roping, nails, things that fit into plans. What he did not have was the answer to the quiet question that had traveled with him. Take me with you. That night in the boarding room he sat by the window and watched the plane press its shoulder against the town. People came in and out, cooks, peddlers, men who had made trades and returned to pockets of whiskey and laughter. Elias felt apart from their roundness. He watched his hands as if they were foreign tools. He thought of Ioka's hands, the way they moved grain from one sack to another, the sure knotting and untying. Her hands were not asking to be carried. They asked only to be known and to be in company. He went to the saloon because the saloon was where men measured the world. The leader of the riders was there, and when Elias took a seat at the far table, the leader spoke as though they were on neutral ground. "You staying long?" the man asked. "For a day," Elias lied. He did not want to be pressed by questions he had not yet chosen to answer. The leader's laugh crinkled into the air like folding tin. "You ever think a man can settle?" he said, half to Elias and half to the empty room. "Most of us don't. Keeps a man honest, moving." Elias tasted the phrase like a grain of something raw. "Sometimes moving is how a man forgets," he said, plain as a tool. The man's face altered, just enough. He looked at Elias then, and for the first time not as a specimen. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's a man's way of keeping himself out of trouble. Settling'll get you in the way of more trouble." There was a point to the leader's words that had nothing to do with the soft morality of towns. It was an observation of the earth's shape. Settling draws attention. The leader smiled then, small and without malice. "Good hunting where you're headed," he said. Elias left with the roan's price counted on a scrap of paper in a pocket and a feeling like a scale balanced on a pin. Stay, go. He thought he could buy the horse and leave, and in buying he could take with him a woman's life as if it was simply a new thing to manage. The thought made him catch in the throat. He had been a man of the road so long that the road presented itself as a balm. He had been on the move to avoid the way fires make inside you a furnace of memory. But he had also come to know, in a small room patched with tin and sage, a way to be known slowly. He felt, with a new kind of clarity, that taking someone with him would be to convert that slow knowing into motion, and that motion could be a flattening of a person into an appendage. He slept poorly, the roan's image under his eyelids. He woke before dawn, took coffee from the boarding-house proprietor, and went to the smith. The horse stood ready, patient, its flanks clean. He paid the seller, felt the weight of coin lift off him and flatten into a new responsibility. The roan nickered once at the touch of his hand. Up close, the animal was steady in a way that felt like a promise, but not a solution. He could have mounted then and gone north. He could have turned his saddle toward the horizon and let motion be the answer. Instead, he returned to the trading post, bought bolts of iron and planks of wood, a length of chain, nails the size needed for a beam. His list became something else, tools, not tickets out. The smith watched him, as if reading a weather map. "Planning to work?" the man asked. "Maybe," Elias said. It was easier to mean the stable than the change in himself. He loaded the roan with what little would fit and began the ride back. The distance felt different now, not an absence of planks, but a road with bones he could hold. He rode with his purchases strapped, the roan's sure gait a metronome for his thoughts. The wind lifted and carried the scent of rain, but the sky remained clear, the plain open like a promise. As he crested the last ridge and the cabin came into view, he saw that the riders had not wasted time. Two of them sat their horses on the rise and watched the house with the ease of men who knew what neglect looked like and how to exploit it. They wore the same sour civility as the others, hats set to a slant, the lean of someone practiced in making a place feel temporary. For a beat, Elias wondered if they had meant to test him while he was away, to see how the place held in his absence. Ayoka stood at the fence when he rode into view, her silhouette sharp against the wide land. For a second, the world knuckled into a familiar rhythm, her hands, the beadwork flashing. She did not move when he drew near. The two riders watched his arrival as if it were an animal returning to its enraged owner. Elias dismounted slowly, tethered the roan, and crossed the yard with his pack heavy on his shoulder. "Back so soon," she said, and there was a levelness in the voice that fit her face. "Bought the roan," he said. He did not mention the planks or the chain. The news seemed too small to move any ledger. He felt the rider's eyes at his back like a ledger of threats. Ayoka's hands were steady when she took his pack. She felt the weight as easily as one measures a sack. "Good," she said. "We need posts." Elias looked to the ridge once, then again. The riders had not come down from the hill. They had settled on watching, seeing if their presence could change the shape of how a place felt. He felt the old reflex tug, the road whispering its invitation, wanting him to answer by motion. He felt the other pull stronger now, the possibility of a stable anchored by his hands. Doing the work of taking a place was not the same as being grounded by someone else. It was, he thought, an offering of himself as a tool. They worked then, as they had worked in the first weeks, but with a different sense. The planks were bought with money he had set down in town, and his hands carried the weight of a purchase and a decision. Ayoka and he set posts deeper, bracing them differently, choosing a plan that would keep in the winter's wind. They measured, squared, and raised beams into place where both had to push and pull. The roan watched tethered, head low, chewing the grass like a man considering a coin. Word travelled subtly in a plain town. The riders saw their tests answered by a beam and a joined shoulder, rather than by a rush or a flight. They lingered on their hilltop and then moved on, a shadow that did not break course but slowly softened. They rode past the trading post and the saloon and vanished into the wide land as if their curiosity had been satisfied by nothing more than the fact of occupation. It was not that men like them never pressed further. It was only that sometimes occupation itself is an argument. Two people working a yard, building a stable, making a place matter. That argument is visible. It asks not for compassion, but for recognition. The stable rose over days and then weeks, a set of beams and a roof that, for the first time since the mare, felt like a promise kept in wood. They chose the timbers together. Ayoka would not have planks that bowed under weight. Elias would not have nails that bit in shallow. They argued over measurements and agreed because they were practical. They laughed at mistakes and corrected them. Hands met with no flourish, a palm steadied a post, a calloused thumb smoothed a knot. The work kept the question at the edges of speech where it belonged. It taught them new things about each other, patience under strain, the way both could steady a beam when the wind tried to tilt it. When the last board was set, they painted the door with an oil that smelled of cedar and sun. The roan found his place in a stall with a new manger and a promise of winter feed. Elias tethered him inside and saw the animal settle with a small exhalation, content as a man who knows what he has earned. There were nights when the town still showed teeth, the leader's men passing on the road with a glance that suggested there are economies a man should not upset. But the rider's visits became less a threat and more an accounting of observation. Occupation and visible care wear down the impulse to make a place ephemeral. Maintenance is a kind of claim. People see it, and whether out of respect or convenience, step around its edges. Winter did not arrive with a shout. It tiptoed in with low light, frost at dawn, and the smell of smoke doubling in the cabin. They had work in smaller measures, storing feed, stacking more wood, patching the lean-to's last gaps. The stable stood finished, a clean rectangle that allowed a horse to be housed and a man to be still. They decorated nothing. They simply leaned things into place and then set a routine that resembled the shape of belonging. There was a clarity that came then, not with words at first, but with small domestic choices. Elias began to keep a bundle of cords tied in a place where Ayoka's reach met it easiest. She kept, on the top shelf, a jar with a cloth tied over it, a small thing of privacy that he respected as if it were a closed door. They left each other's space when needed and entered when invited. The nights were not dramatic. They were rich with the plain tasks of two people who had decided to tie their days together. One evening, months after the roan's hooves first found the cabin's yard, they sat by the hearth as the wind gnawed at the eaves. The light in the room was soft, the lantern throwing oil gold across their faces. Outside, snow was beginning to stain the grass with white. They had eaten well, stew made from bones and root, and the stable was closed against the weather. Elias stirred the embers, watching them settle. He felt the history of his life like a ship's line leaded with weight behind him. He thought of the road, of how easy it had been to move, and how gradual had been the dying of the habit. He thought of the roan, and the dust of the trading post, of the leader's watchful countenance on the ridge. He thought of the phrase that had once arrived like a small animal, fragile and demanding, "Take me with you." Ayoka watched him as if she read the ledger in his hands. She did not ask him to explain. She had long learned that explanations tend to thin and make room for old habits. Instead, she reached for his hand and laid it, not as a claim, but as a meeting of two calloused things. "You stayed," she said, "and there was no sermon in it. There was merely fact." "I did," he answered. The confession was simple, and like a hinge fixed in place. He waited because some words had weight that could unbalance a table. She smiled then, small and certain, and not the kind of smile that asked for gratitude. "Good," she said. Her braid caught the lantern light and threw it back like a small coin. He thought he might speak more, of choices, of fears, of roads left behind, but the room held the answer better than any speech could. They had both made choices in silent measures. He by staying, she by not shaping him like a project, by giving him the space to choose without pressure. They had both built a place that would need tending. The answer to "take me with you" had arrived in the hands that hammered the beams and in the decision to make a stable worth defending. There were times later when the question would float back, not like a demand, but like a memory. Once, late in spring, when the snow had been pushed back into gutters and the garden showed its first green, Ayoka climbed into the roan's saddle with a practicality that surprised him. She rode out for a day's work, checking fences and measuring the land with the same exacting eye she used in the cabin. For a stretch of track they rode side by side. The land opened, and the road carried them in a familiar rhythm. Once, as the sun made the world a sheet of copper, she turned her head toward him. "You ever think you might still go?" she asked. And the question was not the same as the first. It was not an invitation to be taken. It was a measure of curiosity about the man he had been. He looked at her, at the braid, at the beadwork catching the light, signs that could have been ornaments if he had wanted them to be. But they were not. They were part of a life she had made. He breathed and felt the steadiness he had chosen. "Sometimes," he said, "but not like a way to run." She nodded. The answer fit the white space between them like a plumb line. They came back to the cabin with chores done. The roan walked sure and unruffled. Their lives continued in the same fashion as before: work, preparation, small kindnesses. They repaired the roof together before the next winter. They planted a modest garden, rows of beans and a few potatoes, guarded with the common sense of men who had learned to bargain with seasons rather than expect miracles. They argued sometimes over the best length for a fence rail, but the arguments were the domestic grammar of two people learning to speak the same language. The town, which had watched and waited as if for a small drama, grew used to their presence. Men who had once given glances now tipped hats, and on some days a neighbor brought by a sack of flour or a bucket of salted meat, an economy of help that was not charity, but reciprocity. The riders' visits dwindled into the same kind of weather, occasional, non-committal, the way a storm can pass without doing damage. Elias never again said aloud the phrase that had landed in him like a stone and made ripples, "Take me with you," in the exact manner that first time. It no longer needed to be spoken. It had been answered in the clatter of nails, the set of posts, the careful stacking of winter wood, and the quiet refusal to make a person into a travelling trinket. Ioka, for her part, never said she would have left had he chosen to go. She did not make promises about what might have been. That was not her way. She kept private the photograph in the jar and the small facts of her life, and she kept open her knowledge of the land like a practical offering. The story of their days was not a romance of sudden declarations. It was the slow accretion of trust. It was watching the roan sleep in his stall. It was finding a kettle already warmed on the hearth when one returned cold from the fence. It was the exchange of glances as they raised a beam, hands finding the same rhythm. It was the choosing again and again to stay and to work. One evening, with the stable cold and the day's light drained, Ioka rose from her chair and walked to the door. She turned, and in the hush between them, she said plainly, "You didn't take me with you." He smiled, because there was nothing to argue. "No," he said, "I didn't." She stepped closer then, the lantern making her face soft. "Nor I you," she answered. It was a small truth, stated and without flourish. There was no need for more. The phrase that had once been a question had become a settled fact. Neither had been taken. Instead, they had built a place where taking was unnecessary because staying had been chosen. They shut the stable door for the night and walked inside to the hearth where the light pooled around them like a domestic map. The roan stirred in his stall and shifted his weight, the soft creak of leather and wood joining the room's quiet. Elias found his hand in Ioka's as naturally as a man finds a tool. He did not place his hand there as a claim, nor did she let herself be smoothed into something smaller. They stood as equals, calloused and patient. Outside, the wind wrote winter's first long sentence across the plain. Inside, the lantern's light hummed and held. When the night deepened and their work had been put to rest, Ioka reached up and unfastened the little beadwork strap at her satchel in a gesture that had nothing to do with ceremony. She touched the beads almost as if blessing them, then let them hang. Elias watched without asking. "You could have left," she said at last, not seeking an explanation. You chose not to. He felt the truth of that in his bones. I did, he said again. The smallness of the words fit the room. He had no flowery pledge to make. There was only the plan he had in his head for the next year. More planks, thicker feed stores, a fence line mended. Love, as they both practiced it, spoke in lists of chores that would be done because the person you loved lived on the other end of the labor. She leaned against him then, not as a woman saved by a man, but as a companion who had looked the same choice in the face and found the wisdom to let him make it without coercion. She placed her head against his shoulder the way one rests a tool in its peg, and it meant everything and nothing at the same time. It meant the end of a question and the continuation of work. Outside, through the small window panes, the roan shifted and blew a breath that steamed in the cold air. The stable stood behind them, solid and honest. The road that had once been an answer sat untraveled for now. The title that had first crested in a hot day, "Take me with you," had been examined, offered, and ultimately answered by a different verb: stay. They had answered it not with a phrase, but with the daily, slow courage of repair and presence. Later, before the snow thickened and locked the world into a quiet map of white, they planted a row of willow posts beside the stable, markers for the coming seasons, and good fences for small animals. They spoke of a garden to come, of a winter hearth that would be warm enough for friends and poor neighbors to gather. They did not make proclamations about forever. They made plans with the confidence of people who knew the future would be weathered, not conjured. Their companionship was a practical thing, and that fact was its own deep tenderness. In the spare hours, when the firelight lounged across the beams and the rooster's call had not yet stung the world awake, Elias sometimes found himself tracing the line of the beadwork on a yoker's satchel with his fingertips. She would catch his hand and let him, and neither would speak of what it meant. They had both learned that the meaning was in the doing. If you like this tale and want to follow more stories like it, you can subscribe for the next one.